Okay, this is a meeting of the Sam and Esther Dolgoff Institute. Today's guest is Mark Leier, who's going to be talking to us about Bakunin. So, Mark, we'll turn the meeting over to you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all for inviting me here to speak. It's a real privilege and an honor here. I wanted to start with this quote from Walter Mosley, the detective fiction writer, because I think it's probably the best really short description of Bakunin that I've come across. And Mosley wrote in a short story, Bakunin knew all about the gross injustices of Stalin before Stalin was born. He was probably the greatest political thinker of the 20th century. He didn't even live in that century. He was a man of action, and so he didn't spend enough time writing cohesive documents of his ideas. Don't get me wrong, he wrote a lot, but he never created a clear idea of anarchist political organization. After he died, the writing he left behind made many small-minded men see him as a crackpot and a fool. And so it is a piece of fiction, but I think he really kind of summed up Bakunin and the legacy, the twisted legacy that has been created by a lot of Marxists and by liberals who never bothered to read him, or if they did, didn't bother to understand him. So I thought I would talk just a bit about Bakunin today. To talk about some ideas. And actually, since there are people here that know lots about Bakunin, turn much of the session over to questions and comments and discussions, if that's okay, and if I can be trusted to rein myself in time here. Like a lot of people, I first discovered Bakunin through Sam Dolgoff's collection and his introduction and commentary. I had this version of the book Bakunin on Anarchy, carried it around for a very long time as a young person, and found it deeply inspirational and powerful. Clearly, not enough people, though, read this book because I think if you, and I don't mean the people in this group, but in general, people know anything about Bakunin or think they do, what they know, these four things: that he was an advocate of violence for the sake of violence as a progressive revolutionary act, as propaganda by the deed. And this, of course, comes from the famous quote, "The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." People presume that Bakunin argued that revolutions happen spontaneously and that they don't require prior organization or theory or specific conditions. There is a notion that Bakunin held that the revolution would always be made by the poorest in society, what we sometimes today call the underclass or the lumpenproletariat. And there's a long tradition that says that Bakunin and Marx differed greatly on who would make the revolution, how it would come about, and what it would look like. And I'm afraid that if these are the four things you know about Bakunin, these are four things that are absolutely wrong, all right, on here. And I want to suggest that Bakunin and Marx had a lot more in common than a lot of anarchists and a lot of Marxists want to admit here. I would even start by saying that to the uninformed observer, they even look a lot alike. They're just, hairy, bearded guys. And I think that if you were to put this lineup in front of people, who was the one who mugged you? Which one is it? They would be hard pressed sometimes. Right? I particularly like the pictures on the upper left. They're both standing on a chair. This is a very common way for photographers to arrange people here. And the picture. The next picture, which is Marx, is the last picture that we have of Karl Marx, but he looks a lot like Bakunin in the hat here. And the two young men at the bottom left, they look different, but I don't know if I could pick them out. The bottom two pictures are both Bakunin. One is a photograph. The other is a painting that I just discovered the other day apparently by a French artist of the time named Nicolas Gay. It captures at least, I think, Bakunin's penetrating blue eyes that everybody who knew him commented on here. So I think that even their physical appearances and their mode of dress blur the distinctions. And I, looking at their lives, they have a lot more in common than we sometimes think. They were born only 4 years apart, and both were from fairly well-off backgrounds. It is true that Bakunin's family was part of the Russian nobility, but that doesn't mean what we think it means. He was not an active player at the court. The family was not active in court. It did mean that they had done some service for the Tsar and then were admitted to the very complex table of ranks. But probably better off to just think of them as being of the kind of middle class in the way that Marx's family in a very different society was in the middle class here. So I know that one reviewer of my book on Bakunin wrote that he was really disappointed to discover that Bakunin had not been raised in a cave by a she-bear. He wanted a notion of Bakunin as a ferocious, uncompromising revolutionary that was always ready to blow something up. And so he really did not like the fact that Bakunin was, like Marx, an intellectual. He went to university. They both attended university in Berlin, though they did not meet each other there. By 1838, slightly before he goes to university in Berlin, Bakunin's translating Hegel into Russian and writing important commentaries on his work. And this is partly, I think, the influence of Alexander Herzen, who wrote that for us, Hegel had provided this early period the algebra of revolution. So like Marx, he's reading Hegel, seeing in him the philosopher not of stasis and continuity, but of change. And of course, this is extremely exciting. When he goes to Berlin a couple of years later, he spends as much time as many students do in the cafes and the pubs as he does in the classrooms, which has got to be a lot of fun when you're going out with people such as Ivan Turgenev, Kierkegaard, and Engels as, part of your class here. He really did not, however, like studying history at the University of Berlin because the classes were taught by Leopold von Ranke. Ranke had been brought into the university precisely to put an end to the influence of Hegel. Von Ranke was very much a conservative as a historian. His famous phrase was that history should be examined and taught as it essentially is, how it actually was. Now, by that, von Ranke meant more than just getting the facts straight. I don't think any historian has suggested that we should write history as it actually wasn't. But he did mean to say that history should just be presented and should not be interpreted with any notion of what we would today call presentism, using the past to think about the present creatively. And that is a pretty conservative way to think about history that Bakunin critiqued in his writings. He did suggest that, yes, we could know facts about the past and pile them up the way that von Ranke suggested historians should do. He insisted that just looking for facts, that kind of Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am, way, reduce history to the dead work of memory, to the simple preservation of contingent singular facts. And that, he said, turned history into the empty play of contingency, and so became nothing more than fantastic flashes, not based on anything and proving nothing. And I think that most of us here would see that as a good critique of conservative and liberal historians today, who actually do have a theory of history. They just don't want to talk about it very much and pretend that their objectivity means we should just listen to them and then just take up their conservative and liberal analysis here. But as Bakunin wrote, If history is nothing more than a senseless succession of accidents, it cannot be of interest to humanity. It cannot be an object of our knowledge, and it cannot be useful to us. So even as a historian early on, he is insisting that history requires interpretation and theory. And of course, we know that Marx shared this view, created something called historical materialism, and that was an idea that Bakunin agreed with. In the excerpt, of course, of God and the State, he starts by asking, who is right, the materialists or the idealists? And he says, of course, it must be the materialists. And this starts very early, as it does with Marx. They're writing roughly at the same time and coming up with very similar ideas. Both of them abandon philosophy for politics. And Bakunin's first extended essay, The Reaction in Germany, is written in 1842. So he actually beats Marx into print with this article. And that's where the famous line, the passion for destruction is a creative passion, comes from. But it's important to remember that he's writing as a left Hegelian in this period. And so when he's talking about destruction, he is not talking about throwing Molotov cocktails. It's a good thing, too, because Molotov cocktails were about 100 years in the future. But his point was that this was a philosophical statement. But it's one that so many liberal critics have seized upon to suggest that he was simply the advocate of mindless violence, of violence for the sake of violence. He was also determined in this piece to argue that philosophy was not the key. So he's rejecting that part of his intellectual past. And he claims that, I think quite realistically, that the Declaration of the Rights of Man, in theory, gives political equality to everyone, but the language of it concealed the fact that, and I'm quoting here, that the working class was still condemned by its birth, by its ties with poverty and ignorance, as well as indeed with actual slavery. So, like Marx, in the early 1840s, he is moving away from the speculative idealist philosophy that he had been trained in and moving to look to real practical politics. He continues to argue that labor is the sole producer of wealth, that work was the fundamental basis of dignity and human rights, for it's only by the means of its own free, intelligent work that humanity becomes a creator and creates the world of civilization. And while so many people look to Marx and his early works, his economic and philosophic manuscripts, to get that sense, they look to the German ideology to see work as part of humanity's species being. Bakunin was already there before Marx's stuff becomes available. So my point is really they have a very similar intellectual trajectory. It is the case that they differ on certain questions, but again, I think that many of these differences were based on them reading past each other and not reading each other with a certain charity. And I think it's not an accident that their political feuds in the First International happened without them actually meeting each other. They did not attend the same meetings of the International. And so these were more like internet flame wars than serious political discussions with the aim of trying to work things out. And this has led to all kinds of misinterpretations as certain kinds of Marxists turn to Marx as a prophet for reasons, I think, that Bakunin explored in much of his work. And it takes us back, I think, to the quote from Mosley, and the line about understanding about Stalin before Stalin was born. Because one of the things I think that Bakunin is properly remembered for and is a really important piece was his writing on the role of intellectuals in left and labor political movements. He was deeply suspicious of intellectuals, and this comes in part from his fighting with Marx, but I think it's more fundamental than that. It really, I think, gets to the heart of his anarchist ideas when he argues that intellectuals have a role. We have the great luxury of time to read and to think and to argue that most working people do not have, he argued. That does not mean that we should be leaders. It means that the role of the intellectual is to, I suppose today we might call it to be a facilitator, to help people express themselves more clearly. But he insisted that it was going to be workers themselves and what he would call their instinct for revolt that had to lead the revolution. And that really, I think, grinds up against the Marx who insisted on getting things right. That he was keen to say, look, this is how this works. And if you don't agree with me, you're a moron and you should be purged from the movement. I exaggerate a little bit, but Bakunin, I think, was deeply, I don't think, I mean, he says it himself, he's deeply suspicious of intellectuals who have a tendency to become a new priesthood, that they have figured out, in the case of Marx, how history works, and therefore believe that they should lead. And this, I think, is the insight that Moseley picked up on. That this is the issue with Lenin, with Stalin, with Trotsky. We know what is to be done, and we will tell you, and your choice is to get with the party program or get purged. And this was something that Bakunin located in Marx and Marx's ideas and Marx's actions. I have to say that my own suggestion is that while Bakunin was right about Stalin, he was right about Trotsky, he was right about Lenin, he was not so correct in his analysis of Marx. And I would suggest that the way to think about that relationship is that one can look at Jesus Christ and Christianity and end up at either Opus Dei or liberation theology. And you can make a logical progressions to both of those positions from that. And neither is inevitable or fixed. So, and I think that is true of Marx as well, but I think that's not a point that Bakunin was prepared to give to Marx, that he saw in his intellectual work a real vanguardist tendency. And I agree that tendency is there. I would not go as far as Bakunin did to say that this is absolutely hardwired into Marx and to Marxism. And I think that we all have examples of anarchist-adjacent Marxists, the council communists, for example. We might argue about Rosa Luxemburg on that spectrum, but I think closer to the anarchist view than to the Leninist position or the position that Bakunin would have attributed to Marx here. But I do think that what Bakunin identified was the possibility, and as we have seen, the reality of the creation of a new class of intellectuals that took it upon themselves to act as if they were a universal class based on their intellectual capacity, what some people today would call their social capital. And this idea was taken up by Jan Václav Makajski in the 1920s, who was the first to critique Bolsheviks as part of this new class. And it's in his biography. Trotsky talks about, oh, yes, we were talking, Mikhail was one of us, and he was really great. And then he started applying what he thought was historical materialism to Bolsheviks, and so he went off the rails. It was a completely disavows that penetrating historical materialist critique when applied to himself. No, we are not a new class because we represent the working class. And that, of course, takes us back to Bakunin to say, yeah, there is a strain in intellectuals who think that they can be the universal class, and they use that to pole vault themselves into power. And in the 1970s, John and Barbara Ehrenreich write about something they call the professional managerial class, or the professional middle class, that I think also parallels Bakunin's critique of intellectuals when they act in their own interests, but pose as the saviors of the working class and believe they should be put in the vanguard. So I think his ideas on how to organize, his warnings about intellectuals, this idea of the new class is the part of Bakunin that may be of most interest to us today. Because Mosley was correct. He was a man of action and did not spend enough time writing cohesive documents of his ideas. God and the State is probably the piece that people first read when they want to look at Bakunin. And for lots of people, it's pretty incomprehensible. It's not an easy intro into the ideas of anarchism. I mean, I know the first time I read that opening phrase, who is right, the materialists or the idealists? I was lost. I have no idea what this 19th century debate is about, and it doesn't get a lot better from there. So to make sense of Bakunin means plowing through a lot of material. He had a grasp, as Herzen said, of coming into a situation and quickly understanding the crucial elements of it and being able to make some extremely prescient and thoughtful remarks on it. When Bakunin was traveling across the United States as he leaves Siberia, is exile there, gets to Japan, takes a ship to San Francisco, and then travels across the United States. He sums up in a few really poignant and powerful phrases a great critique of American exceptionalism. That Americans think of themselves as a city on the hill, and they are completely blind to the reality of slavery, to the reality of industrial capitalism and class conflict in America. It was just a cogent piece that he just kind of wrote on the fly. But perhaps like Francis Ford Coppola, when he had a lot of time to produce something, didn't always work out really well. So his huge piece, the Nauto-Germanic Empire, is hugely repetitive and goes on and changes in midstream from subject to subject, and did not do himself a service by not having a ferocious editor to pull this together here. And so we're often left, I think, floundering. Gregory Maximoff tried to pull it together. I thought it was a really ambitious work where he went through tons of Bakunin's writings and pulled out thematic sections and kind of lumped them all together. But as Sam Dolgoff noted, it was not a successful project, in part because he's pulling out pieces from different periods of Bakunin's career, putting in sections where he was writing not as an anarchist, along with his later work where he did think about this work, tried to, I think, enforce a consistency that probably wasn't in his work. But reading him for flashes of insight and that ability that Herzen noted to pull out the essential critical pieces of a situation, of a moment in history, or of trends was a really strong feature of his work if you have the patience to get through it. In some of his shorter works, he wrote a series of articles for newspapers that actually are much more useful. And Cutler has assembled several of them in a book called like The Basic Bakunin, something like that, or where I would direct somebody to go if they really wanted to quickly grasp Bakunin's ideas here. And one of the pieces I really liked is when he's writing on education, and it sums up his ideas on intellectuals and class, where Bakunin noted that often a very bright worker must stand silent while a stupid scholar gets the better of him, not because the latter has any sense, but because of the education denied the worker. And this, to me, seems to be a trenchant criticism of universities and the professional middle class today. In fact, that we have nothing like the universal education that Bakunin called for, and we see that, I would suggest, in the rise and support of Donald Trump and other politicians like that today. He argued that education itself was a form of capital that could be passed on. This was an idea that Mikhail took up later and explored at length. And this formed the materialist critique that Bakunin made of intellectuals here. And thus it's important to note that he was not critical of intellectual work. He was critical of the fact that it was denied to most people because of class in these capitalist societies here. That anti intellectualism, again aimed at intellectuals and class position, is still, I think, just so relevant and so important today. And it's one of the crucial points that I think contemporary anarchists like to make, even when we are in danger of losing it. And by that, I mean, one of the problems with Marx is that he provided so much fodder for intellectuals. There are so many debates within Marxism that you are all aware of. The idea that John Sayles used in his great short story at the Anarchist Convention. He applied it to anarchists, but it applies to Marxists too. It's not divide and conquer, it's divide and subdivide. That's what rules us, right? and with Marx and Marxists, we see this, of course, all the time, because it has become the playground for intellectuals, and that's something that Bakunin warned about, and warned that we could not live in the world of theory and ideas. He had a huge respect for Marx and his work, though he gave up on his task of translating Capital into Russian. He thought it was just too complicated, and anyone that has struggled with those first couple of chapters of Capital might agree. But also said the problem with Marx is he wants to turn workers into intellectuals, and blames them when they don't respond the way he thinks they should. So again, I think in a pithy way, he captured the real problem with Marx and Marxists, which is to actually remove themselves from the working class, to use their education as a form of social capital, and to, as I'm afraid I have to confess I have done, to study the working class to avoid being part of it. And that's a problem. That's a problem for revolutionary movements. Right? It's not a problem in terms of having a job and educating people. These are good, laudable things. But it is a problem when intellectuals move into politics and think that social capital also means they should know what's going on. They should be in charge, because that is the high road, or perhaps the low road, to vanguardism. And that does take us to the misconception that Bakunin argued that revolutions happen spontaneously. He didn't. He never argued that there was no organization or theory that was necessary. It was a question of where the theory came from and how it was used. And he didn't say this, but I think he might have agreed with the sentiment that revolutionary theory is too important to be left to intellectuals, that it needed to reflect the conditions of work and working people. Intellectuals had that role to play of perhaps facilitating, of cleaning up a little bit, of helping people confront the contradictions in our thought and the reality and theory here, but never to assume positions of leadership. Like Marx, he did not think that the poorest in society, the underclass or the lumpenproletariat, would be the leaders of the revolution. He did appreciate that peasants in Russia had a particular role. And ironically, that's the position that Marx came to later in his own life. He, as you know, started studying Russian in his later years, precisely to figure out what was going on in Russia, and arrived at a position that Bakunin had arrived at 20 years earlier, that the peasant life and conditions did, in fact, mean that they would play a huge role in the Russian Revolution. It's something that many Marxists have denied and have ignored in Marx's own writings here. So let me just finish so we have some time for other people's comments and questions, to suggest that Marx and Bakunin shared a lot, including, in a very simple, crude way, a physical appearance. Their ideas were not as different as we sometimes think. Probably the key difference is the role of intellectuals and theories in the labor movement and in radical movements. And even then, I think that part of their division and their split, their rancor, was based less on what they thought and what they have actually written, and on, I'm hesitant to say personalities, because that's the common escape. You'll say they just didn't get along. That's not quite true, but I think they had very different perceptions of the role of theory and intellectuals in that movement. Perhaps you might think of it as different professors that you have had. You may have had one that was brilliant, but not very kind and not very forgiving. The one in the seminar that would literally ridicule and embarrass people. And you might hate that class while understanding that the professor was brilliant. And that would be Marx. Bakunin is the professor that said, we're here to learn, and we can do this, and we don't have to call each other names and insult each other. We can move, and that might be a more rewarding experience for you than the one who appears to be so brilliant and is just such a bastard. Right? So in that sense, that may be where their personalities differ. And it's something I've suggested may be more like roles that we adopt sometimes in classrooms or in social movements, as teachers, as organizers, as rebels, and those social roles often put us in real conflict with other people until we think through that and realize that we need all of these different capacities to build a movement. So let me just end by saying I think that if I wanted to write an alternative history, it's a very popular genre. It's, what if the Americans had, what if the North had lost the Civil War? What if Hitler had won? I'd like to write one that said, what if Bakunin and Marx actually got together for a beer after one of their fights in the International and just decided they would talk until they hammered this stuff out and realized that they both needed each other, that they borrowed from each other and they built on each other, never acknowledging that. If they had done that, had put it together, what might the revolutionary movement have looked like 10, 20, 100 years later? And I'm never going to write that novel. I hope somebody does, because it might be a way forward in the face of all of the fights and divisions that are still going on in the left today between Marxists and anarchists. So I've yelled at you for 45 minutes. Let me stop now and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Mark, that's very good. We'll open the floor to questions and comments. So, Maria, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just thinking that what I, knew of their differences, not myself not being an intellectual or historian, was simply that Marx believed in a dictatorship and Bakunin didn't. And Bakunin would talk in terms of libertarian communism and that the means do not justify, the ends do not justify the means and that sort of thing. I mean, that's what the split was in the First International, right? So it wasn't, just can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I would disagree, because of course our spirit is to divide and subdivide, right? Here. I have not seen a passage anywhere where Marx says what we want to do is to have a dictatorship. He does talk about a dictatorship of the proletariat, but by that he's pretty careful to say, look, this is the dominance of one class over the bourgeoisie. He does not talk about a vanguard party. He does not talk about gulags. I think that what Bakunin did fasten on, and I think Bakunin was right to do so, was his emphasis on theory and intellectual work to get it all right, and then follow that. But I don't think that Marx, let me back up. Marx certainly acted that way in the few political organizations he was engaged in. I mean, he purges Weitling from the League of the Communists because Weitling was not a sophisticated thinker. But that's really different than creating a political party that aimed at becoming the state. Right? And I don't see Marx talking about that, doing anything with that. I think what Bakunin had done in his Bakuninist way was to look at this, look at the writings, and, as Harrison said, pull out an essence, pull out the possibilities, pull out some elements of this that he wanted to combat. But it was always on the level of theory rather than anything that Marx had said about, like Lenin, who talks about we need a party of the new type and you pretty much have to pass a socialist theory test to get into the party and you're going to be a professional revolutionary. Marx does not say anything like that. So that's what I liked about Mosley's point, where Bakunin knew about Stalin before Stalin was born. He knew about Leninism before Lenin was born. But I think that when we look at what Marx said and did, he identified a possible tendency, but not the living reality of what Marx was saying and doing.
But then just a quick follow-up, Russia, it's supposed to be a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, and it will both the anarchists and the authoritarian communists wanted to come to the same conclusion, where there's a free society, etc. But I don't know, are you saying that Marx did not advocate this temporary dictatorship and that was extrapolated by other communists, and then they started, because everywhere you go, there's supposedly temporary, to educate the masses and so on.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So that wasn't what Marx was advocating.
That would be my argument. Yes. I would grant that you can read Marx in a particular way and pull out pieces that support that view. But I think that it's contradicted by what Marx typically did and what he said. I mean, when he says things like, look, the revolution starts at the level of the commune. That is, the free city. And that's how workers will be managers. When he says that the liberation of the working class is the task of the working class itself, I think he was sincere. I think what Bakunin spotted, however, was the tendency for intellectuals to substitute themselves for the working class. And I think that is absolutely a way to read Marx. I think it's a way that's inconsistent with much of what Marx actually said, but it is a way that was absolutely adopted by Marxists and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, of course, the great exemplars of that.
All right, Jared, he has his hand up, and then I think Anatole may have raised his hand, and then Shelby. So, Jared, you want to ask a question and make a comment?
Yeah. So from what I understand, where a lot of this critique of Marx comes from isn't so much in the writings and the theory, but in the way that they interacted in the First International. Mm-hmm. And the Marx and his followers wanted to subordinate all the sections to the Central Committee and ensure that they all prioritized political parliamentary struggles, whereas Bakunin and the collectivists opposed that and caused a huge split. So, wondering what your thoughts are on that part of it.
Yeah. I think that is the kind of anarchist response, and to look at the splits here. But I think again, it's overstated when you read what they're actually debating at the International. I think that it's in a way it's an oversimplification, and also it's overly complicated here. And I think that they are always talking past each other, that they had very different issues that they were using some of the arguments in the International to support their real agendas. And what Marx was concerned about was factionalism in the International. Okay? There's no question that Marx was a Russophobe, right? That he does, and that Bakunin was a Germanophobe. Like they were both afflicted, and so they come into the International, if you can imagine this kind of scenario, very distrustful of the other, even though they had gotten along on certain times, certain periods. When they meet up in London in the 1860s, Marx writes that, Bakunin is one of the few people who seems to have gotten better over the years. All the other comrades have gotten worse here. So they both regard each other with a great deal of suspicion. I would speculate, but wouldn't want to go too far, by saying that they really had such different positions in the movements that they were, I think jealous is probably too strong a word, but each had such different strengths and weaknesses that the other didn't trust them. And by that I mean Marx was a ferocious intellect, and, if I can pardon the expression, something of an asshole. Right? Bakunin was not. Bakunin was a brilliant guy, but unlike Marx, did not write this stuff out, did not write and rewrite and parse all that. And so Marx, I think, did not have much respect for him. and thought that he was a poseur. He hasn't done the work, right? You talk great, you didn't write the thesis, right? Bakunin, from all accounts, was genuinely liked by people, partly because he let them speak, let them bring their ideas to the floor, was less interested in intellectual rigor, and appreciated the passion, the zeal, not for mindless destruction, but for being human, and did not like Marx's, what he thought was his cold, Germanic approach to this. And even when Bakunin goes to the University of Berlin in 1840, he's going, "Oh, Berlin, oh, what an amazing city. It's so much better than Moscow, so much better than St. Petersburg. Except these Germans, they're always clicking their heels and saluting." Right? So they bring just such a different energy to it that and you may think about this in your own interactions in political movements, right? That people sometimes will think, that they have different roles. For example, some people might categorize themselves as helpers. If there's an action, they're the ones that have got the first aid kits and they're putting band-aids on people. Other people are the rebels. They're there to smash windows, right? You have organizers and you have advocates, different people with different roles, but these roles sometimes clash with each other. So if you're at a demonstration and someone's been hurt and you're putting a bandage on and somebody smashes some windows and now the cops are firing tear gas and using batons, helpers tend not to have a lot of respect for the rebels. Right? Rebels at the same time say, "You helpers, you're not building the revolution." Right? And I would suggest that the two roles that these people, Marx and Bakunin, adopted were, in that same sense, roles filled with tension that can be resolved, but take work to resolve. Because these social roles sometimes come out of our personalities. Right? I'm a conflict avoider. I'm a conflict instigator. Well, that doesn't tell you anything about what the conflict is about and what should be done, so much as it does about these deep-seated personality traits that can cause so much friction in movements.
Anatole, did you have something you wanted to say, or?
No, I enjoy your speech, your talk very much, Mark.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could say some things about what you might call the slander of Bakunin as a person that came down. Like Marx accused Bakunin of being an agent of the Tsar.
Yeah.
It's not exactly an ingratiating approach.
Nope. No, and, you're right.
Other aspects, Bakunin was impotent. How do they know this in the 19th century? He had a daughter who looked just like him. She was a successful academic in Italy. I know, geologist. She was a top-notch geochemist and volcanologist in Italy. And became a university president or something by this time. She died in the 40s. She knew her father was Bakunin. And all the different things they said about him. You touch upon it with the spontaneity, but he was under the influence of Nechayev and all this kind of what I consider to be horseshit.
Yep, you're absolutely right, Anatole. You're absolutely right.
He was incestuously involved with his sisters because he wanted to get them out of bad marriages. Yep. I mean, all kinds of stuff that they said about him.
Yep, no, you're true. And it's not limited to Marx and Marxists, but Marx, on a couple of occasions, accused Bakunin of being a Russian spy. Absolutely, I think, unforgivable, especially in that context, right, where being called a spy could easily be a death sentence. The association with Nechayev has been grossly misinterpreted by people who are mostly out to get Bakunin. Mosley, a lot of small-minded men saw him as a crackpot and a fool, and they were dead wrong with this. But Marx's behavior in those instances, absolutely unforgivable. It also, in a way, speaks to the charge of Bakunin's anti-Semitism, right? Which was in part stoked by Marx's continued attacks on him. There's more to it than that, but that didn't help. Right? So yeah, no, I have absolutely no sympathy for that part of Marx and Marxists who just lie. They are just completely uninterested in the facts.
Shelby, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking less of what these two thinkers had to say and more of their actions in the First International. I mean, face it, Marx had the First International move its headquarters to New York,
Yep.
not because he was trying to organize the American proletariat, but
Yep.
because he wanted to destroy Bakunin's following.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's power politics on an organizational scale.
Yep, no, I agree with you, Shelby. Yep, I have skirted over that today, but it is the that's the reality. Absolutely, I would say I think that the International, by the time he moves it, has run out of steam. Yeah, they're not exactly fighting over a corpse, but they're fighting over a patient that's not doing very well here.
Mm-hmm.
And Bakunin, Marx was, I think, as worried about the influence of the Proudhonists in the First International, who probably outweighed both the Bakuninists and the Marxists on here. And that reflects his insistence on a kind of doctrinal purity that Bakunin had little patience for, and that Bakunin saw as a way to the authoritarianism. And I think he was right about that, less right about it in the International, in part because they're not talking about state power here, but certainly it is the tendency that Lenin and others adopt without a moment's hesitation or pause.
All right, Jared, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one other question about if you could tell us a little bit about Bakunin's relationship with nationalism and pan-Slavic movements and all of that. Because I know when I read Statism and Anarchy, he had a lot of really interesting things that he wound up saying about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're pretty relevant to what we're seeing today in a lot of places.
Yeah. Can I throw that back at you? What are the pieces that you found to be really interesting and relevant?
Well, I think it's interesting that
just for a second before we continue, could you stop screen sharing your?
Yes.
If you go to the button, there we go.
Yeah.
So I think today when we see people like Steve Bannon or Netanyahu or Trump or a lot of these people, they're very nationalistic, and they're trying to create this coalition of nationalist movements around the world, almost as a sort of new response to neoliberalism. But I think this is kind of what was happening too in the time of Bakunin, where you had the pan-Slavics and you had Italian nationalism and you had all these other flavors. And what's interesting in that writing is you see him, affirm that nations have this right to self-determination, but then he makes some really interesting arguments about why that's, why it's a problem when you start creating nation states and things like that. And I think transcending that impulse is something I don't see a lot of socialists and anarchists doing today. I see them kind of adopting this lazy affirmation of national liberation struggles without taking the step Bakunin took.
Yeah. I think you've hit on some really important things here, especially. I mean, the obvious one, of course, is Ukraine and Russia today, right? I think Bakunin's pan-Slavism is a period that he goes through before he calls himself an anarchist. Right? So he becomes an anarchist fairly late in life. In fact, I think it's not really until the sort of late 1860s, and it does take place in the context of the Russian Empire. And as somebody who served in the Russian military, he was pretty aware of the power of the Russian state, and did see in Poland, especially, as many leftists did at the time, a connection between leftism and nationalism and anti-imperialism that was worth supporting. Later, I think he becomes critical not so much of the nation, but of the state. So he does talk about, look, there are groupings of people and in definitions of nation that we still use today. They've got a certain shared economy, a certain shared culture, and they should be allowed to do that. Right? That you should not have a state or an empire crushing that. And I think that that is the position that he evolved to later as an anarchist. But in his early one, I think his Pan-Slavism is best seen as anti-imperial and anti-Russian. Right? Not surprising after spending the time that he did in the Tsar's jails and exile in Siberia. Right? This here. Now, and it is an issue that, of course, is hugely debated today among anarchists, especially about Russia and Ukraine. So there are some anarchists that have argued that, in fact, the Ukraine should be supported in any way possible militarily. Others that say a pox on both their houses. To be honest, I don't know what I think, and I don't know what Bakunin would think on this one.
I think as a group, we did put out a statement in support of the Ukrainians when the invasion first happened.
Yeah.
And I think it was more from the point of stopping Putin's aggression against that country, not so much as we're rallying behind Zelensky or anything.
Yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to point out was that I think the stumbling block between anarchists and Marxists is this whole idea of working class political parties and political actions. It's not simply the role of intellectuals, but it's the problem of that when you start getting involved in politics and power seeking by the political parties or whatever, then you run into this problem of instead of necessarily furthering the interests of the working class, it's more of how do we get power and how do we keep power and then it's power. It eventually becomes power over the working class, not the power of the working class.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think that Bakunin absolutely holds that view. Though this was less of an issue, I think, in their time than it becomes afterwards, and it is partly, I think, connected to the question of reform versus revolution as well, and. That's one, in fact, that anarchists and Marxists will split on in all kinds of different ways here. Bakunin at one point said, look, I hate to say it, but I think we have to vote in this election because the alternatives are so stark. And Marx could say, look, the revolution's necessary, but maybe in England, maybe in the United States, maybe in Holland, we can fight and win reforms to the political process. And if we see these on a spectrum and push them closer together, I think we can do when we look at what they've actually said and done, then there's some room for some very healthy debate on what is to be done now, in this moment, whatever this moment is. Noam Chomsky has said on occasion that it's immoral not to vote because the small chance for small reforms is worth it. It's worth the 10 minutes it takes you to go and vote, right? If it means somebody on welfare gets $20 more a month. Should you put your energy into organizing with the Democrats? No, right? But so in that sense, I guess I'm more interested in kind of complicating that issue to decide whether we should do what we should do in this election, right? As opposed to historical battles.
Well, I would point out then that the Spanish anarchists, of course, voted for the Popular Front in 1936, and eventually that led to the Spanish Revolution. Joe, did you have something you wanted to say?
You're muted.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
To the point you just made, I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
In terms of what can be done now, I wrote a piece for Freedom last May, which is a kind of analysis of the film that I did. Steve and Maria were involved in, called Anarchism in America, which kind of touted this view at the time that, Americans are essentially anarchists, even though they may not call themselves anarchists. And it was a self-critical piece because we interviewed a truck driver, and the truck driver was talking about, well, if they just lose all the regulations, I'll be free to do what the hell I want, then we'll have a better economy. Well, my point in the article was this guy probably would be a Trump supporter these days.
Yeah.
So in the article, I went into the issue and I said, if you're an anarchist and you really want to see change, you really have to weigh the reform versus revolution kind of thesis. And my own personal thought is, yeah, you got to vote, whether it's local elections or federal, big scale elections, because I think we're at the point now where we're in the midst of full blown fascism. And I think that, little measly anarchists are not going to go out on the street and confront ICE, and it's going to be, to the barricades. But so the only way, I'm thinking is vote in local elections, do as much as you can within the community to support those who are resisting oppression.
Yeah.
And, it's a tough time to be an anarchist these days.
It's a tough time not to be a Nazi. Unless you're a fascist, somebody's coming for you, right? That is the grim reality, right? And so, I think it's difficult to predict and suggest and say this is the only thing that we should do. Right? So I appreciate your point.
Well, listen, I'm all for knocking a Nazi. There's no listen. If you confront it one-on-one, shit out of it. But I'm just saying, in terms of the community and how you can really make an effort to do something of value, I think it does start with the community. I live in a kind of small area, and I think it's important to turn out for local elections. Whether that translates into voting in federal elections is another thing. It's a personal choice. I think it's worth doing now, just because we're faced with this kind of apocalyptic future.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I don't know what Bakunin would think about that, except there's a couple of quotes late in his life where it's like, we have to vote because it will make a difference. Things are so bad right now that any breathing room that we can get is necessary. Right? But
this kind of reminds me of those that would go around with WWJD bracelets. What would Jesus do?
What would Bakunin do?
Yeah.
Did anyone else have something they would like to ask a question of Mark or make a comment?
Thanks for a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your kind words.
Thank you, Mark.
And can I say, I'd like to thank all of you for the work that you have done over the years. I think I'm a little younger than some of you on here. I've read work by many of you over the years and have seen films, and this is a pretty amazing group of people, of activists, of scholars that I'm just very proud to have been asked to talk with. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next meeting is going to be November 23rd. We're going to be meeting with Peter Cole, and he's going to be talking about Ben Fletcher, the IWW Local 8, and a little bit on what dock workers have been doing now to stop some of the mayhem that's been going on around the world right now. So please see you next month, and I'm going to stop the recording at this point.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks, Jeff,
everyone.
for
I'm going to
putting
hit the
together.
road.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much,
Thank
Mark.
you.